Ideally, I think what would follow the Fed is what preceded the Fed. We made it as a nation until 1913 without a Federal Reserve. We went through the Industrial Revolution without the Federal Reserve. What I would like to see happen is a return to the constitutional monetary system that the framers of our Constitution envisioned. And so, from the point of view of the United States government, I think the Treasury would go back to coining money. And coining money is taking money, which constitutionally is gold and silver, and making coins out of it, and issuing coins. Notes, note currency, the bills that we carry around, those bills existed prior to 1913. They just were by the Federal Reserve Bank. They were issued by others. To go to Bank of America, for example, and you want to borrow $100,000, they don't issue their own notes to you. They rediscount Federal Reserve notes to you. That's what dollars are. They are Federal Reserve notes. Even though it says $1 on it, that's not what it is. It is a note. It claims to be. It says Federal Reserve note, this note. And so it is a promise to pay. It used to be a promise to pay dollars, but now it's a promise to pay nothing. It's just a piece of paper. But before banks were issuing Federal Reserve notes, they issued their own notes. So if you were an entrepreneur and you wanted to take out a loan from the Bank of America, they would issue you 100,000 notes drawn on the Bank of America. And that's what happened. Prior to the Federal Reserve, there were bank notes floating around the country. And one of the reasons for the Federal Reserve was because, let's say you lived in New York and you traveled out to California and you had in your billfold some notes from a bank in New York and you wanted to spend them. You could take the, bank notes and spend them just the way you spend Federal Reserve notes. But what if the person in California didn't know? What if that bank failed? What if they weren't in business anymore? So the whole idea was to substitute a national note to replace all these individual notes because people would know it. But in today's day and age, with all the internet and the communications, it would be very easy for someone in California to verify the legitimacy of a bank note drawn on a New York bank. So I don't think that's an issue today. When we originally established the Federal Reserve, there was an idea that we would have an elastic money supply. And what an elastic money supply meant was that the money supply would expand as the economy expanded, but then contract as the economy contracted. Well, as we now know, that doesn't happen. What happens is when the economy is growing, the money supply grows, and then when the economy contracts, it grows even faster. It never shrinks. It's now just an engine for perpetual inflation. That was one of the main reasons for the Federal Reserve. It no longer exists. So ideally, if we can simply go back to real money, constitutional money, where the government simply coins money, which is all that was given the power to do in the first place. In fact, when they first wrote the Constitution, there was a movement to allow Congress to issue bills of credit, and it was struck down. I think it was 9-3 vote. We didn't want the federal government printing money. And in fact, the reason that the Federal Reserve is a private bank, it is not part of the federal government. It is a private banking syndicate. One of the ways that you know this, if you ever get a letter from the Federal Reserve, it's got a stamp on it. If you get a letter from the government, there's no stamp because it's, this is a private. They actually pay a tax. The Federal Reserve pays a tax to Congress. They're allowed to make a certain return on their assets, which is why the Federal Reserve building is so expensive, because they know whatever they earn is going to be paid to government in a tax, but it's private. The reason constitutionally the Federal Reserve had to be private was because Congress cannot do what the Fed does, because Congress did not have the power to issue bills of credit. So if we can simply restore the monetary system envisioned by our framers, we can achieve two things. We can eliminate inflation, and we can go back to the deflationary environment that we had prior to the Fed. In 1900, prices were half of what they were in 1800. So without the Fed, Americans enjoyed a rising standard of living and falling prices. I know today, you talk to your grandparents and they're going to say, oh, gee, I remember when I was a kid, that only cost a nickel. Now it costs so much money. Well, our grandparents, their grandparents were telling them, gee, when I was a kid, it was it was twice as much. Now it's cheaper. So we would go back to falling prices, which benefit everybody, and we would cut off the ability of the government to run deficits. The government would have to shrink because the government would only have the gold that it collected to spend. It couldn't simply print money and monetize its debt. So I think the country would function very well without the Fed. The problem is Can we ever get there? My fear is if we ever abolish the Fed, we would simply turn the printing presses over to Congress, and they would be even be more irresponsible than the Fed. You know, when people in the audience raised their hand, they said, you know, they want to make the Fed more accountable. The idea is to make it less accountable. If we're going to have it at all, let's have it completely independent from the political process, so they have the guts to stand up to Congress and not buy their bonds and raise interest rates when they have to be raised, instead of keeping them artificially low and perpetuating these booms and busts.
Thank you, Peter.
I just wanted to respond one thing on the Constitution, that there is legal tender. Article 1, Section 10 clearly states that no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin legal tender in payment of debt. Since the federal government is not given the authority to do that, it's clearly reserved to the states. So that is what is legal tender. Right now, you know, we are not, but there is that framework. And the one thing we do need, what you're talking about, is there is a bill to exempt from income tax the profits on gold. And that's, if we do that, then we do give individuals a choice to use gold and transact in gold and not hold Federal Reserve notes. Right now they can't do that because every time they buy something, they generate a taxable event. So in order to have a real competition for the Fed, you need to remove the income tax on gold.
What are the chances of that bill passing? Zero or?
Probably zero, yeah.
Zero.
I guess.
Actually,
but if I'm in the Senate, at least I'll vote for it.
Go ahead, Richard.